Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Matt Bagnoli. I have the pleasure of serving as the Chief Development Officer here at the Fund for American Studies. I'm happy to be with you today back on our webinars and pleased to be able to offer you guys, our TFAS partners and investors, an opportunity to hear from some of our outstanding TFAS faculty. Don Boudreaux is a professor at George Mason University, and Anne Bradley, our George and Sally Meyer Fellow in Economic Education and TFAS's Academic Director. Just a little bit of housekeeping quickly. If you have questions during the webinar, you can submit them at any time through the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. We are not going to be actively monitoring the chat box, so please don't put your questions in there. Use the Q&A button. We will work to get through as many of them as possible in the time we have. And I'll give you another reminder about that. You can put them in the Q&A box at any point during the presentation. You don't need to wait until the end. With our housekeeping out of the way, I'm pleased to introduce our president, Roger Ream, who is himself an alumnus of our programs, for a few brief remarks and to introduce our speakers. Roger, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. We're just so pleased you're with us for a very important topic. The Fund for American Studies is committed to teaching what we like to call, borrowing from the great Paul Hayne, the economic way of thinking. We do that through a whole range of programs for high school students and teachers, for college students, and for young professionals. We are really trying our hardest to be the go-to place for young people who will be leaders in the future to come to learn about the importance of economic freedom and the connections between the economic way of thinking and human flourishing. In all of our programs, whether for high school students, college students, or young professionals, we work very hard to find the best to teach those important principles in the classroom and in boot camps and seminars, in the written word. And we have two of them with us today, two of our outstanding stars. Matt mentioned both, Anne Bradley, our George and Sally Meyer Fellow, and Don Boudreaux, who is past chairman of the economics department at George Mason, our academic partner in our college programs, and a current professor there, as well as a senior fellow at the Mercatus Center, and the recent author of The Essential James Buchanan, which was published by the Fraser Institute and co-authored by with Randy Holcomb. Anne Bradley had a piece just yesterday in the Washington Times on the subject of today's webinar, and Don has written much in the past about this important topic and about the importance of a price system that is not being interfered with by government at any level, so it can convey the right information to producers and consumers. And that's going to be part of what we're talking about today. So thank you so much for joining us. Matt will be chairing this. We appreciate your support of our work, and we will work as hard as ever in the coming year to continue to teach the economic way of thinking and American values to students. I'll just end by saying that we're going to be welcoming to Washington, D.C. about 300 students in just a few weeks. We'll have a record attendance at our Economics for Leaders program for high school students. So this is going to be a great year, outstanding year at the Fund for American Studies, and we owe it to you and your support. So I'll turn things over to Don Boudreaux first to get us started. Don.
Thank you, Roger and Matt, and thanks to TFAS for having me. It's always an honor to do this. So I tell my students, I teach 18-year-olds every semester, and one of the things we cover is the role of prices. The course I teach, an old-fashioned name for it is price theory. It's now currently called principles of microeconomics, but prices are really important. Economists stumbled upon this insight a long time ago. And here's what we notice. Every time there's a natural disaster, hurricane, blizzard, earthquake, you name it, here's what happens. Prices of certain goods, staple goods, bottled water, propane, plywood, depending upon the particular natural disaster, go way up at first. The height to which they rise and the length to which they stay up is positively determined by the severity of the event. So you'll get higher prices and they'll stay up longer if the hurricane is a very severe one compared to if the hurricane is only a moderate one, for example. And then the prices start to come back down gradually, and they eventually pretty much settle into where they were before the natural event happened. The way this process, this unfolding of the change in prices is portrayed in the popular media is unfortunately uniform. There's one theory that the media seems to have about such price changes. I call it the greed theory. Now, a theory is only a story we tell about how to make this very complex world of ours more understandable. And so to some people, the greed theory does make sense. It's kind of, yeah, greed seems to explain it, right? Greedy sellers are raising prices. A lot of problems with the greed theory, but one big problem, there are two big problems with the greed theory, is special problems. One, if that's the theory that explains the price rise, why do people wait until natural disasters in order to get greedy? Why aren't they greedy just all the time? Why do they wait for a hurricane to strike? An even deeper problem is what explains the price declines afterward. If you're going to explain the price hikes as the result of greed, you have to explain the price declines as the result of altruism. But you never see a reporter out in front of a Home Depot or a hardware store or a supermarket saying, important news, folks, an outbreak of altruism has arrived, and that's causing prices to fall. So I don't think that's a very good way to explain the observed, a universally observed process, a pattern of price changes. One other thing to keep in mind is that prices are, you don't have a price unless you have an actual exchange. And so Home Depot, if it wants, it could set a price of $1 billion on a piece of plywood if it wishes. No one's going to buy a piece of plywood at $1 billion, and so the price of plywood is not $1 billion. When you actually see prices rise, that's because, of course, sellers are willing to sell at the higher prices, but buyers are willing to buy at the higher prices. And so if you're going to use the greed explanation, you have to accuse of being greedy not just the sellers who are selling, you have to accuse of being greedy also those buyers who are paying the higher prices, because it's the buyers who are willing to pay the higher prices that compel you, if you want to buy that thing, to also pay the higher price. If there were no buyers willing to pay the higher prices, then there would be no higher prices. So obviously what happens when natural disasters strike is two things simultaneously. Demand goes way up. In the event of a hurricane, for example, I grew up in New Orleans, so I know a lot about hurricanes. In the event of a hurricane, for example, there's the huge increase in demand for plywood. People use plywood to protect their windows from being blown in, and then after the hurricane strikes, they need plywood to patch up their roofs, to rebuild their dog houses, to rebuild all the things that get destroyed. So demand goes way up. People wouldn't have to buy the plywood in these events had there been no destruction wrought by the hurricane. And supply at the same time goes way down simultaneously. Not only are inventories destroyed, but most importantly, supply lines are obstructed. Delivery trucks can't get through. Workers are stuck at home with their families rather than being unable to come into work in order to produce the goods and deliver the goods to market. Those two things combined make goods and services more scarce than they are in normal times. That's an unfortunate reality, but it is the reality. And the higher prices do two things. They, number one, reflect that reality. They reflect the fact that the likes of propane and plywood and bottled water are in fact much more scarce in the aftermath of a natural disaster than they are in normal times. It's an unfortunate reality. No one likes it, but this unfortunate reality is not caused by the high prices. The high prices are a reflection of that reality. The second role performed by these high prices is that they incite both buyers and sellers to act accordingly, to act in ways that are more consistent with the fact that these things are more scarce. So the high price of plywood means that people who would otherwise, if they happen to get to the store first, otherwise buy plywood at the normal price in order to repair Rover's doghouse. They say, whoa, I'm not paying $50 for a piece of plywood to repair Rover's doghouse. That leaves the plywood available for someone who has a more urgent demand, someone who has to patch up the roof on his or her house. And so the higher prices cause some consumers to not buy when they otherwise would buy at the lower prices. More importantly, the higher prices incite sellers to bring more to market, precisely because a lot of supply lines are obstructed. In order to entice workers to work, in order to entice people to go to the extra effort to deliver supplies to market, these suppliers have to get paid an extra amount. It's only fair to compensate them. And so the higher prices compensate suppliers to bring the much needed goods and services to these places, thus relieving people who are in especially high need of things like bottled water and plywood and propane, thus helping to relieve that need. I tell my students, I'm going to shut up in a moment and let Anne talk, but when I tell my students this story, I remind them of the tale that we've all heard of the king who kills the messenger. Right? It's an obvious story, right? You don't change the message just because you kill the messenger. So the king sends the messenger off. I'm going to change the story just a little bit to make it even more applicable to the price story that we're talking about. So suppose the king is sending his army off to do great battle against the enemy and tells the messenger, says, all right, messenger, I want you to come right back from the site of the battle, and I want you to bring news of the battle, but bring me only good news. So if our team wins, if our army wins, tell me that we've won. But if our army loses, tell me that we've won. Right? So the messenger, after concluding that he's working for a wacky king, the messenger goes off with the army. The army, of course, loses the battle. The messenger comes back and says, King, great news, we've won the battle. Right now, of course, in this story, changing the message doesn't change the underlying reality. Oh, in fact, it makes the underlying reality worse. The king doesn't know that his army's been defeated, so the king's sitting there, and so the enemy army is much more easily able to attack him in his castle. The higher prices reflect an unfortunate reality. They reflect the unfortunate reality that the natural disaster has made some important goods and services more scarce than normal. And it only makes matters worse if government prevents the messengers, which are the price system. If it prevents the messenger from delivering this message clearly and loudly and unambiguously to people who most need to hear it. So, thank you. Anne?
Thank you, Don. Yeah, so, I think you'll find that Don and I are cut from the same cloth, which is people who want to bring the economic way of thinking to bear on these relevant and timely policy issues. And I think, just kind of jumping from what Don just was talking about, nobody wants to have, or at least from a consumer perspective, right? We don't want price increases. Temporarily, those price increases hurt our budget constraints because all else equal, our income has remained unchanged. So it is reasonable for people to be upset or worried about these price increases. And we certainly, when we think about prosperity, we always are thinking about how to lower prices and increase access, increase affordability, which results from increasing availability over time, not decreasing. So I think the way we start with some of these issues is to say we understand that these price increases are very difficult for consumers. I don't think any kind of legitimate economist would disagree with that. But I think where we have to get from there is to say, what, if anything, can we do about it? And so economics is about kind of capabilities, right? It's not about necessarily the price that we all want to pay, because as consumers, and Donna already mentioned this, right? We move along our demand curves. And of course, as a consumer, I would like to pay nothing for the things that I get. I mean, wouldn't that be great if you could walk through the grocery store and just put whatever you wanted in your cart and walk out, right? I would be happy as a consumer, but firms would then have no incentive to provide me with the things that I need and want. And so these countervailing forces of supply and demand work together. And so prices are always a negotiation in a market economy. So kind of the starting point for us as economists, I think, is that we can't get away from the fact that we live in a world of scarcity. And that might sound, kind of obvious. We learned that in Econ 101, but it seems to me that in the policy space, we start to walk away from that. And we also believe that the government is the institution that can intervene kind of in markets in different ways to try to get us that, or to engineer the outcomes that we want. But that requires that we reject this precept of scarcity. So I think, the economic way of thinking starts with, we live in a world of scarcity and we live in a world of uncertainty. So as Don said, the best policy in the world will never allow us to ward off a hurricane, right? Or to ward off a pandemic. If we could establish and use policy to make all the bad stuff never happen to us, that would be great, but that's not the way the world works. And so hurricanes will happen, and pandemics will happen, and floods will happen, all these types of things that tend to cause supply shocks in an economy. So I think the bigger question for us is not only what is the appropriate, if any, policy response warranted in that time, but thinking about the underlying market conditions that bring these things to people and that provide the incentives for us to be able to deliver more of the goods and services that people want in times of crisis. So I think this conversation in this webinar today are in many cases precipitated, at least in my mind. I mean, Don has been writing about, price gouging and other types of these microeconomic concepts and ideas for a long time. But to me, as I think about, what happened with the Colonial Pipeline attack last week, you kind of see the same response coming from the media and coming from policymakers, which is to say, this is an unprecedented shock. It's resulting in higher gasoline prices at the pump in the very short term. Kind of saw a quick increase in prices. That increase in prices is bad for consumers, which we've already agreed that that's the case. And so then the government kind of responds in a way, and I think the media and the rhetorical response, even from consumers, is protect me from this, protect me from the price increase. And so again, I think what economics is well poised to answer is, can the government protect us? And as Don already mentioned, price theory is about understanding the emergent and cooperative nature of prices. So the price comes from exchange. It does not exist prior to exchange. And thus, kind of the price is the agreement between the suppliers and demanders at any given time, and reflects or tells us something about the underlying levels of scarcity. So in a supply shock, whether it's what happened last week or a hurricane, we saw something similar but more extreme happen at Hurricane Katrina, which was 75% of Gulf Coast refining capacity was offline for 6 months. That's a really big regional supply shock. And so what the economist kind of looks at and says, when scarcity changes, you need a mechanism to give that information to people and to ration, right, the consumption. And so I kind of think of prices as like a traffic light. Green means go, red means stop, and yellow means slow down, or maybe it means speed up. And so the subjective nature of our preferences dictate, what's green for you might be yellow for me. But the point is that the relative price changes give us information immediately, and they help us know what to do. That doesn't mean that, again, back to my first point, we don't want higher prices for consumers. My argument is that we need higher prices in the short term, in the face of a radical supply shock that we can't prevent beforehand, because that price increase is exactly the mechanism that not only moderates consumption, but it gives firms information, right? It says that all else equal, this is a more profitable venture. And so that is what gets you, kind of the market into gear. And so, price gouging laws, I think, make us feel good because they make us feel protected, that we're not going to have some kind of greedy corporate firm. And Don already talked about greed, right? That, they can act impulsively on the scarcity, the news shock, and they can kind of stick it to us. And if you look at price gouging laws, they're very different state by state. Some states have nothing on the books, but I can tell you that, for example, California has price gouging laws that suggest potentially up to a $10,000 fine and a year in prison for a price that's 10% over a 6-month average. So the way we kind of try to understand, or I guess legislators try to understand what the limit is for the price to increase is based on a 6-month average before the crisis. But I think the point here is that that's an arbitrary intervention that's going to exacerbate the problem. And it also fosters these unintended consequences of hoarding and panic buying, because, you know, if the price were allowed to rise to its natural level, you would naturally have, you know, a reduction in the consumption, which allows the supply to get back to what people need it to be. So, you know, I think it's interesting too, and maybe this is something we can talk about. Consumers don't really decry when prices go down, right? And so if you look at prices, you know, for example, TVs have decreased in price by something like 80% since the late 90s. And, you know, consumers aren't upset about that, right? They're just, we take it, we love it, it's good for us. And so, you know, if it works in that direction for us, is there an ethical argument that the government should protect us from price rises in a time of a supply shock, which is actually, again, the mechanism that's going to solve the problem? So I think the message that you're hearing from both of us is that economics provides us a way to think about the long-term solution to the problem, and that government efforts to protect consumers in these instances are both not only arbitrary, because who could possibly know what the price of gasoline should be after a Colonial Pipeline attack? There's no way we can know that. And so we need the market to do its job so that it can adjust. So market economies are about adaptability in times of uncertainty. And so you need to allow the prices to work so we can get back to a state where they go back down and supply increases. So, you know, I think we have to think about both sides of the coin. And as Don already talked about, you know, we can assume firms are greedy some of the time because they're populated with human beings. We can also assume consumers are greedy some of the time because they're also human beings. And so, you know, kind of the operating principle here is that people are going to respond to incentives, and the market is a great venue for allowing the right incentives in the right institutional setting to get that supply back to what we want it to be. So I'll stop there, and Matt, let you take it away.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you, Don. Very informative. As a reminder to everybody, you can submit your questions in the Q&A box, Q&A button. It's at the bottom of your screen with little bubbles on it. We've got a couple questions here. The first one is from Roger. If you, and specifically looking at other alternative responses rather than the immediate adding of price gouging laws, the governor of Georgia suspended all state taxes on gas. Was that a good or a bad response in terms of obtaining market prices? And we'll open this up to either of you, whoever wants to jump in first.
So, I didn't know that. I missed that news. I mean, I'm all in favor of cutting taxes, but I think in this case, I mean, if we assume that the taxes are reasonably justified, say, as a source of paying for roads and road repair, then that becomes part of the cost to motorists of helping the state maintain its bridge and highway system. And so in that case, I don't believe, I think that's a bad reason for lowering, for cutting those, for eliminating those taxes or even lowering those taxes in that situation. If the taxes are not justified on that grounds, and they should be eliminated or lowered anyway. If they are justified on those grounds, then the fact that the supply of gasoline has been arbitrarily or surprisingly cut back is not a good reason for eliminating those taxes. So I don't think that's I don't think that argument, that I don't like that response by the governor of Georgia. It's better than laws against price gouging for sure.
Yeah, it's better than some responses, but I
Yeah.
agree with John, and I think, it also kind of maybe invites lots of volatility in what taxes are going to be one day from the next, and I think that leads to a lot of unpredictability, and that's going to harm entrepreneurship and, again, this whole supply process and the innovation that it requires.
Yeah.
Yeah, it seems to me that would you have your own distortion in the marketplace, because at some point he's going to put those taxes back in and prices are going to go back up, unless I guess he's planning on timing the market perfectly to, as the prices go down, reinstitute the taxes to,
Well, the
to
background
maintain
on,
an equilibrium.
the background on this was my daughter lives in Georgia, and she told me one day last week, our gas stations are all out of gas. And I said, well, you need your government there to encourage gas stations to raise their prices.
Yeah.
And she said, no, they've eliminated the gas taxes. And I said, oh, that's only going to hurt the supply. People even buy more gas than they otherwise would, because it'll increase demand over what it would be. But thank you.
Can I say something more
Yeah.
about? So one effect that neither I nor Anne in our opening remarks mentioned, but it's worth pointing out, and it's easily observed, right? So when you have price controls in place, including those that are designed to prevent so-called price gouging, one very common result is, or queues, the British call queues, we Americans call long lines. So you have people lined up to get gasoline, you have people lined up to get plywood, lined up to get propane, lined up to get whatever goods are in short supply. And that's incredibly arbitrary. So what that does is give artificial benefit to people who happen to live nearby the Home Depot, so they can get there first and get to the front of the line. If you live a long way from a Home Depot, for example, and you're at the back of the line, by the time you get to the front of the line, oh, I'm sorry, sir, ma'am, we just run out. Or it gives artificial advantage to people whose time is not as valuable. So the young couple, for example, whose home has been severely damaged and they have to stay at home to take care of the kids as they patch up at home, they don't have time to go wait in line. Whereas maybe the middle-aged couple who, I keep using the example of the doghouse, their doghouse's roof has a hole in it, and they like to fix it up for Rover, and they have all the time in the world, so they can wait in line for the good. And so the queuing, the waiting, is an incredibly arbitrary manner of distributing the goods that are in short supply. I believe a lot of people who support legislation against price gouging, I think they think that what happens is, okay, that prevents rich people from getting it, making it more abundant for poor people. I don't see that happening at all. I mean, I suppose a poor person can happen to be lucky and get to the front of the line, but generally rich people are better able to pay. Elon Musk can pay someone to go wait in line for him, whereas most poor people can't do that. And they're more constrained in how they can spend their time. And finally, and we know this from empirical studies, and you also know from common sense, these pieces of legislation, they also reduce the quality of the goods that are available. So so Home Depot, let's say, gets some of its plywood, gets waterlogged because of a flood. This is stuff they might not otherwise sell, but if they can't raise their prices and there's a shortage of plywood and people are waiting in line, maybe people they wind up getting a piece of plywood at the normal price, but the piece of plywood they get quite often is going to be a good of inferior quality compared to normal. They'll get the waterlogged, they'll get the piece that they otherwise wouldn't have purchased because it doesn't match up to the quality expectations that they had. There are all sorts of unintended consequences from prohibitions on allowing prices to move to their market clearing levels. And I can't frankly think of any unintended or even intended good consequence. It's just a really bad policy that somehow sells well politically.
Yeah, Don, it's actually your plywood example at Home Depot is interesting to me, just because I been building something in my house and buying a lot of plywood, and the price is more than $50 a sheet of plywood nowadays. But B, the other thing I noticed is that the quality is not as good as it's been unless you're buying the really premium stuff. So I think you're already starting to see some of that, the supply move in as the prices have gone up. But our next question comes from Edward, who questions, Governor Whitmer is trying to shut down a fuel pipeline across the Straits of Mackinac that supplies Michiganders and Ohioans. How does, could, or should this affect pricing in their area?
Want to take that, Ann? Me?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that we had this kind of, this was in the news when President Biden also decided to, walk back from the Keystone Pipeline. So, this is the question about, how are we going to get this precious resource that we need? And if we close avenues to get that. Now, I don't know anything about this project in particular, so maybe Don or somebody else does more than I do. So sometimes these are very politically motivated projects, and the political will is being used to direct resources in this specific way. I don't know if that's the case here, but I do think so. We have to be careful about how did this come to be in the first place. But I mean, from a supply and demand perspective, it seems to me that, we need to find more avenues for gasoline and petroleum products in general. We have to get it out of the ground, and we want to be able to have as much of it as possible. This goes back to all the supply questions we've already talked about today. And so I think political intervention in those types of projects necessarily will impact gas prices. So it seems to me that even you could make the argument that that's already happened in the United States with the Keystone Pipeline, because there's an expectation that there will be less. And so, we're going to have to find a way to get it somewhere. I think the problem, I'll just say this is related to gas, not as much like, water in a crisis or perhaps lumber, but, petroleum is one of the most politicized products out there. And this creates havoc because we don't really have, I wouldn't say that we have kind of a fully free market in this good. And so it's already distorted. And so I think we want to be careful about adding layers of distortion on top of it. So it's a complicated market to me in that sense. And so, I could talk more about the other ramifications of that, just kind of nations' desires to be energy independent. I think that factors into gas prices and things like this. But I would say, we want a free market in this resource because that's what's going to service consumers. We also want to make sure we don't deplete that resource. So we want to think of innovation along substitute energy sources, which of course is already happening. But I think kind of political intervention in that can be dangerous because it leads to these outcomes we don't want. Don, I don't know if you want to respond to that or add.
No, I agree with everything. Not surprisingly, I agree with everything that you say. I mean, there's no question that shutting these pipelines down makes the supply at the consumer level of petroleum products less than it would otherwise be. And therefore the prices will be higher than they will otherwise be. Matters would only be made worse, however, if on top of the pipeline obstructions, government tried to restrict the price increases. And so at least consumers will see the consequences of these actions. Whether they'll attribute them correctly is a separate question, but they will see the consequences of the actions in the form of higher prices higher than those prices would be were the pipelines not obstructed.
That's great. How do we really, and I'm asking this as much for myself as for Charlie, who posted the question, but how do we really explain this? So I've got a lot of friends that are kind of politically in the middle. They aren't terribly liberal or anti-free market, but they're not through and through free marketers. How do we explain to them that this hoarding is a response to the price not being able to adjust? And you've given us some really good answers here, but I wanted to see if either Don or Anne, do you have a really good kind of anecdote that really drives home the point that this hoarding is a result of the marketplace not being allowed to adjust prices when a shortage happens in the commodity, gas in this instance, for those of us on the East Coast?
The simplest I mean, so actually, this can be answered in multi-layers. But the first answer, and I think Anne will agree, if not, she should speak up. I think the first answer is, okay, who hoards? Well, the people who manage to find supplies of the good. If the price is kept artificially low, that gives them an incentive to buy up even more of it. If the price is allowed to rise, not constrained by legislation from rising to its market clearing level, that itself will dissuade people from hoarding. And just I'll mention one other layer to this. One incentive, not the only, but one major incentive for hoarding is the expectation that the good will be more difficult to get in the future. And when governments impose prohibitions of price increases, that fulfills that prophecy. It in fact makes the good more difficult to get in the future. And so people are responding rationally. So they're thinking, oh my gosh, this is going to be impossible to find in the future. I better buy up the gasoline now. I better buy up the toilet paper now. I better buy up whatever it is now. And so they do that. I think if governments were not in the habit, not all of them are, as Anne mentioned, in the US, this is done at usually the local level. But enough governments are. If governments were not so much in the habit of prohibiting price increases in times of natural disaster, I think people would become accustomed, less worried after the fact that prices would rise, and that would reduce, not eliminate, but it would reduce their incentives to hoard the goods. And so if prices are not capped by government dictate, the more hoarding you get, that just drives prices up further and further, thus dissuading people from hoarding. When prices are capped, there's no check on the hoarding. The hoarding occurs until literally you just run out of supplies, and no one has any incentive to bring more supplies to the market because the prices are not allowed to rise in order to incite suppliers to redouble their efforts to bring supplies to where the supplies are in high demand.
Mm-hmm. I completely agree with everything Don said. And so he just beautifully spoke to the economics about it. I think that if I had 5 minutes with someone, I would say what he said, and then I would also say, and at the end of the day, we hurt the very people we claim to help. Yeah. Just that's the result and we eliminate the correction of the problem, right? So you just kind of you go in to intervene in the system and you break it further. And that is, I mean, it's hard for people to understand, myself included. I don't want gas prices to go up any more than I want any price to go up, right? But I think if you can see the bigger picture, and that's what I would want to say, to somebody, as you mentioned, Matt, kind of a skeptical but open-minded person. I think you want to say, we don't want to put the government in the position to stop the correction and to hurt the people it's trying to help. Because as Don said, look, Elon Musk has minions, and he can go hire those people to stand in line and to make, you're also going to create an entirely underground or secondary market here. If it runs out, now you have people selling, we saw this in the pandemic. People are like making hand sanitizer in their basement or something and selling it out of the trunk of their car. And that just raises search costs and transaction costs and makes it harder for people to get things. And I think wealthy people can buy their way out of that problem in a way that people at the bottom of the income distribution cannot. So I think there's an inequality or a justice angle we can highlight that the markets, kind of get you out of that spiral.
I love it. So the next question is going to take you guys maybe a little bit out of the economic wheelhouse, but I think it's probably a pretty good capstone question. We might have time for one more after this, but this is kind of a twofold, which is price gouging laws seem to be a case of politics trumping good economic reason. You guys have done a great job laying that out right for us here. So the follow-on question is, how do we win the political battle to rid ourselves of these price gouging laws? Is there a political will or a way to create a political will to do something about this problem?
So that's a great question, and I am not optimistic on that front. I think if you understand the economics of the matter, it's a no-brainer. You just don't have these pieces of legislation. If you don't understand the economics of the matter, it seems to be a no-brainer. Wow, we can keep the prices low by dictate. Well, why not do that? It just, most people believe that the only consequence of these laws against so-called price gouging is that it reduces the amount that greedy sellers get by allowing consumers not to have to pay so much, and so it helps consumers of low and moderate incomes. If you think that's the only impact, then you're not going to win the political war. You're not going to win the political battle to get rid of these things. So the answer would be better economic education, support TFAS.
Yes.
Well, I wonder if Roger agrees with that.
Probably.
I like that answer, Don.
Here, 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 here.
Anne, do you have anything to add?
I just absolutely agree. I think it's not about, it's, you know, I've had kind of very smart people, smarter than me, more educated in different fields than me, say, I remember my friend saying, you know, there's this one gas station in DC when you drive in a certain way, kind of by Georgetown, and the prices are very high all the time relative to, I live in the suburbs of Virginia. And, you know, that has everything to do with the supply and the location and the taxes and all those kind of things that we've already talked about. But her response is they're always price gouging. And I thought, okay, well, this kind of invites a conversation about how markets work, entry and exit into markets work. And so I do think we just need to foster conversation. It's not about people not being intelligent at all. It's about people just not knowing the economic way of thinking. And I think just with a few basics, we have now opened up a whole new framework of analysis to think about these things. And so then you can have this kind of a conversation where you're saying, I care about consumers, I care about the poor, and that's why I'm against price gouging laws. It's a very counterintuitive thing to say, but I think armed with a little bit of knowledge about economics, you can then, because if you say that to someone, they're like, whoa, that's weird. You know, I agreed with her on the first part, but then she went in a direction I didn't understand. So I think we can open the dialogue. But I also have to say, I mean, this is kind of a depressing end, but I'm kind of with Don on, I think people enjoy price gouging laws because it makes them feel better, even though it doesn't lead to outcomes that help us. So I don't know how you change the narrative on that. It's a tough one.
Can I say one other thing?
Go ahead, Don. I'm never going to cut you off.
I actually became an economist because of laws against price increases. If I hadn't grown up in the 1970s and waited as a very young man, ignorant of economics, in gasoline lines caused by the prohibition in the 1970s by the national government here in the US of petroleum prices to rise, I would have never been attracted to economics. It was the ability of economics to explain to me why I waited in these long lines that caused me to really fall in love with this discipline, and I've been in love with it in the 44 years since I was first introduced to it. And one of the, I think it was actually the first official action that Ronald Reagan took after he was inaugurated as president, that either on January 21st or January 22nd of 1981, was to sign an executive order eliminating all the remaining price controls on energy products in the US. In 1970, Congress gave to the president the authority to institute petroleum or energy price controls. And Nixon and Ford and Carter used these things. Carter got rid of a few of them, but they were still in place, which is what caused the enormously inconvenient summer of 1979 gasoline shortages throughout the United States. And people were so annoyed by that, and it was so visible. Reagan used it as part of the campaign, as part of his presidential campaign. Vote for me, I'll get rid of you'll no longer have to wait in gasoline lines because I will get rid of the price controls. I don't know how much people understood that, but certainly they could see the damage being done. They felt it. It was very hot. They're waiting in line to buy gasoline. And so there was some public learning 40 years ago, but not enough.
It almost sounds like we need a bigger disaster like the 1970s fuel shortages to really drive the point home. Not that I'm wishing for that. I drive a very old truck and is very fuel inefficient and have no interest in going through something like that.
Yeah.
Good. Well, we have reached the end of our time. It is 2:45 right now. I want to thank both of you, Don and Anne, for joining us today. I'm certain our listeners would agree we need more people to understand the truth of the economics around these anti-price gouging laws. We might just get a good outcome if people actually understood that. And for all of you watching, this is exactly what we are striving to do every day at TFAS. Don and Ann are two of our wonderful faculty members who will be teaching our students this summer and throughout the rest of the year. We are very excited, as Roger said, to be welcoming our students in just a few short weeks to DC for the beginning of our summer programs and around the country for our high school programs. All of you today got a small taste of what our students experience every single day in our programs. We are working very, very hard to ensure that the next generation of leaders are champions for liberty and free markets. Our webinar, we've got a bunch of questions already. Our webinar will be available to watch on demand. You'll get an email from either Roger or myself in a couple of days once we've had the ability to process it and get it posted upline. If you are want to share it with friends and family, just let me know. We would love for you to spread this as far and wide as you possibly can. In closing, I just want to offer a special thanks to our investors who have joined us today. Without your support, we would not be able to accomplish our mission. Students that come to our programs would not be hearing these ideas, and you make that all possible. So we are very grateful to you for your dedicated support of the Fund for American Studies, and grateful to your support for the cause of liberty, so that we can impact tens of thousands of lives every year. Thank you again for joining us, and I look forward to our next webinar together in the future. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.